Hey everyone, this is a follow-on video to the last video that I made, which was a response to Veritasium's big misconception about electricity video that he made. And there was a lot of interesting discussion generated by his video, a lot of YouTubers doing similar videos to mine that kind of talk about whether or not they agreed with him and why. And I think in general the consensus was that technically he was correct. However, a lot of people felt, both in the comments and in other videos posted, that he was kind of misleading in his video. The original problem he posed had a technically right answer, but he kind of conflated that with this mock-up that he made, with the car battery and switch and like the normal household light bulb, which in that case, you definitely wouldn't expect to see any visible light right when you close the switch, right? And so people were a little upset that he seemed to be implying that that might be the case. And so I saw a lot of comments arguing that, arguing kind of the engineering problem of it, saying, well, you wouldn't have enough current to, power a 100-watt light bulb or whatever. But when you get down to the theory problem that's kind of hidden beneath, you do get the answer that yes, you do have some non-zero current starting to flow, a detectable signal, if you will, that that happens after 1/c seconds in the case of his video. And so I did my initial video doing the simulation, kind of showing that indeed was the case, and giving you a nice visualization of the electric fields. But there were a lot of requests in the comments of that video. One of the main requests being, or a question was, what happens if the ends aren't connected, right? Because if you have current flowing initially, then it seems like, well, does it even matter if the ends are connected, right? If you can have current flowing in a wire after such a short amount of time. And the answer is no, it doesn't matter if the ends are connected. But in the steady state, of course it does matter. We don't expect a steady state current to be flowing in this disconnected wire that you can see down here at the bottom. And so I'll kind of show what that looks like over time versus the current in this load up at the top, which is connected in a conductive loop. And then another thing was people were curious about the Poynting vector and what that looked like, because Veritasium's video, when he released it, made a big point about the Poynting vector. And again, his focus on that was probably a bit misleading, as we'll see here in a little bit when I show you the animations of that, because the animation he showed was kind of like a square loop of wire, not really this high aspect ratio, and kind of seemed to indicate that you'd expect the Poynting vector essentially to be pointing straight from the source to the load, which in his case I'm sure was right, but in this case we actually see something that's a little antithetical to some of the points he was making there. And then probably the last most common thing that I saw was people being curious if I could run the simulation for longer. I think I only ran it for like 2 nanoseconds. And so I did run it for longer. This one's going to be 25 nanoseconds, and as you can see, I changed the geometry. I basically made it physically larger, just to be a little closer to accurate, although it's still, of course, not the length of a light second long or whatever he said in the video. But it's not even actually a meter from source to load, because it's the way that this software works and these problems are set up. It takes a very, very long time to simulate, and as you increase the size, basically the simulation time increases about probably with the cube of that. And so when I was actually trying to run this problem here, I ran into issues where it was going to take probably weeks to solve, if it ever solved without giving me an error. And coincidentally, I was reached out to by a gentleman named Matt Commons, and he actually works at ANSYS, which is the manufacturer of this software. And we were chatting on LinkedIn, and he had seen my first video, and I was explaining some of the issues I was having in trying to run this larger simulation, and he actually offered to run that file on their cloud computing network, which is more than capable. And so he went ahead and did that, and it was very generous and kind of him to do that. And so, he did that, and I think even there it took a couple days to run this simulation, so you can kind of see the magnitude of simulations like this. But for those of you who are curious, this is run in ANSYS HFSS in the transient time domain solver. And so it's basically a finite element time domain solver, and that's just one small component of what HFSS can do. And even outside of that, you've got other programs like Maxwell 3D, which can do a lot of magnetostatics, and induction motor simulations would be a good use case for that. So they've got a suite of softwares that is very, very powerful and useful if you ever get a chance to use them. So what we're going to see today is more or less very similar to what I showed in my first video, with the included additions that I kind of just explained. So I'll go ahead and just play this here. And another note that's different on the setup is with the previous simulation I did, one comment that I saw a couple times was asking why, when we looked at the vectors, why did we not have basically any electric field vectors prior to the switch closing? Basically, the switch closing was the start of the, I guess it wasn't the start of the simulation, it was like 200 picoseconds after the start, but we basically had, nothing, there wasn't any field, even zero values there, and that was as a result of the way I set it up. So I actually did correct that to where you can see this pulse is actually establishing the fact that we've got 1 volt on this side of the source and 0 volts on this side, and that kind of initial state is actually propagating outwards now and establishing itself. And so you can see that's just a single pulse, and that kind of bounces around for a little bit, so I don't have the switch actually close until 5 nanoseconds here. And so you can see, that's still doing some settling down by the time we close the switch, but it's more or less settled. And just before we close the switch, you can now see that, okay, we've got both sides are positive, right? We see the direction of the vector is pointing inward towards this one little section that is at 0 volts. So now, when we have the switch close, then you see very similar propagating of the electric field. We can see the directions of the field there, and then reaches the ends and kind of rounds the corner / reflects back. Kind of interesting thing to see. And then we also see that we've got action going on down here at this unconnected wire, which looks slightly different, but more or less the magnitude plot and the vector plot look pretty much, they tell the same story as before. So I'll go ahead and move to the things that are new, and the simulation continues to run, and I'll just kind of fast forward it here, but again, nothing totally unique. So if we go back to the very beginning, we can start look at the Poynting vector, which everyone was curious about. And so again, this initial pulse is just establishing that there's 1 volt here and 0 volts there. And it's interesting, you can see kind of the wavefront here. The Poynting vector is pointing to the right and to the left. So you've got this energy propagating outwards along these lines, kind of in a transmission line fashion. And then they hit the ends and bounce back. And then at that point, there's not any clear energy flow in one direction or the other, which is good because it's basically, the switch hasn't closed, so that's kind of just establishing the statics prior to the switch closing. So now you see the switch close, and you do see, a general outward radial direction of this Poynting vector, but of course we can see a very strong, parallel to these lines component of the Poynting vector, both for the connected and unconnected case. If I rewind it kind of before it hits the ends there, And so, that's a little antithetical to the point that Veritasium was making, which is that, the Poynting vector just points from source to load. Well, in this case, you've got these really long transmission lines here, and so you are going to have a good chunk of energy flowing down those lines. But of course, we know that the load still does get current. So I'll go ahead and just let that play. And you can see, once we get this reflection, then it starts to look different, right? The space in between the wires looks very different than the unconnected wire down here. And you can see the magnitude represented by the color. We have more energy flowing close to the wire rather than the space in between. So that's also another interesting thing, that it's certainly guided by the wire. So I'll go ahead and fast forward this a little bit, and not really anything else unique happens. So we can go ahead and take a look at the current plots, which I think will be much more informative than the last time. I included a few more current sensors along the lines, and so that's restarting. So just to point out before we go into those plots, so I've got you can see this thin line here at the source. I've got that detecting the source current. I've got another one out here, kind of detecting the current as it reaches that point. So if we go ahead and we can kind of talk about what we might see as the electric field magnitude plays out here. So initially we'll have see the source current, and then we should see, around this time, we should see the load current up at the top and at the bottom, and not yet the current at this probe here. So some time after that, we'll see the current at that probe, and then eventually we'll see current at the probe right at the very end, of course, of just this shorted case. So let's go ahead and look at those currents in the expression plot. And unfortunately, as you can see, this red trace, that is the source. That is extremely noisy, and that just has to do with the location of that source detector. It's basically right by the edge of the gap where I define the source, and there's just a lot of fringing fields happening there that lead to this noise. But you can generally see the trend of it, and most importantly, we can see pretty clean looking current plots for those other detector locations. So right at 5 nanoseconds is when the source current starts flowing. You see a few bumps here on this pink trace, but that's actually from the initial field that was established at t=0. It's still kind of bouncing around. But you see the blue and light green traces are basically right on top of each other. And those are the loads for the connected wire, the shorted wire, and also the unconnected wire. So we do see that initially they have the same current, because as the fields are propagating, they don't know whether the ends are connected or not. So we see those start up, and then we see this dark green trace is that current probe further down the line that I was pointing out, and that of course happens later. And then eventually we see that the current reaches the very end of the shorted line, which is this magenta or pink trace. And interesting thing to note is the magnitudes of all of these. They're not uniform, and usually, of course, we expect a uniform current through a closed loop of wire. But in this transient case, this current value here is basically just determined by how far it is from the source, because this current is actually driven by the electric field. And actually we'll go into more detail of why and how that all happens, and how it eventually would reach a steady state where the current is the same throughout the entire loop. I'm going to go into detail on that in another video that I'm releasing here at the same time, so I'll link that in the description here if you're curious about more about the why and the how. But essentially we see the current of the loads react, and then as soon as they bounce off the ends and come back to the source, we see they diverge. And You can ignore the negative sign of this current. It's just because the current is flowing in the opposite direction as they are in this line. But the magnitude steps up kind of in pace with the source current. And if we're looking at this green trace, right, it continues to step up more and more. And unfortunately, even 25 nanoseconds isn't long enough to see it reach a true steady state. That would probably require at least microseconds of simulation time, which would just be pretty infeasible with the way I have it set up. But you can see it, stepping up multiple times to get kind of an idea of what that looks like. But if we look at this blue trace of that open line that's just below the source, it basically is alternating around 0, right? So it's negative, then positive, then negative. So it's kind of just ringing up and down, and you can kind of see it just starts to kind of settle out, and eventually in its steady state will settle out to 0, as we would expect. So yeah, it's pretty interesting to see them matching each other initially, and then once the information of, okay, are the ends closed, or are they shorted, or are they open, once that comes back, then they start to act like they ought to. So like I said, if you want a more detailed explanation of how this happens, and just some more thoughts on it, you can check out my other video. If you're just interested in the simulation results, then hopefully this video is sufficient for that. And if you are curious about this program, ANSYS HFSS, and want to know more about how I set up this simulation, I'd be totally willing to do a walkthrough of kind of building this simulation from scratch and showing you about it. So if I get enough interest in that, I might do a video like that. But for now, thanks for watching, and take care. Bye.